A very warm welcome to Not Why But How, a policy podcast where big ideas meet real action. Presented to you by NALSAR Public Policy Group. At Not Why But How, we believe that good ideas are just the beginning. What truly matters is how you make them work. No ivory towers, no endless debates, just sharp, practical conversations on turning policy into action. My name is Devika Veerkar, and we are delighted to host for the sixth episode of Not Why But How, Ms. Sunaina Kumar, a senior fellow at the Observer Research Foundation and the executive director at Think 20 India Secretariat. She has been a journalist for over 15 years and has reported on development, gender, and culture. She has worked as a senior editor with the Indian Express, the Open Magazine, and Tehelka, and has contributed news features to numerous renowned platforms. Ms. Kumar, we are delighted to host you. Thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you so much for taking time out of your schedule. Um,
Thank you,
so,
Devika. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and to be having this conversation with you.
Thank you so much. So I will get right to the meat of the conversation, which is the reason that we were so intrigued by your work is your policy brief on direct cash transfers to women that you published with the ORF. And so having read your brief, members of the public policy group, all of us had this conversation around how intriguing it is that these conclusions came about through your research and how essentially initially I would like to know how you came to do this research in the first place. What led you to examine this sort of policy angle, given how politically significant it has been recently, as well as how sort of the the end that you're trying to achieve by a policy suggestion such as yours with women in India.
Yeah, so I think the start point really for me was the fact that I have been interested through my research on digital and financial inclusion. I've done a fair bit of work on that, especially when it comes to women. But cash transfers themselves are also interesting because they are so hotly debated, right? They're forever dominating the news cycle. A state goes to election, announces the cash transfers. We have the usual news headlines that talk about freebies or handouts to women, the ravery culture, very, very dismissive public discourse. And there is one side of the argument, but the other side is that if this is happening as a policy which now has been rolled out in over 15 states and union territories, then why is it happening? What is the context for it? What is the political economy context? The what, the why, the how, and the impact were really the questions that I think we've not paid enough attention to, and we just need to put them out in the public discourse a lot more.
So, I mean, that's very interesting because when you think about something like a freebie or a handout, you mostly only think about the political consequences of it as opposed to, all right, if this is in fact a freebie, and then if it's actually advantageous, what is so wrong with it? And if it's so disadvantageous, then why is it still economically feasible for governments to do it this way? And so I'm really glad you brought in the electoral angle of it because, like you said, over 15 states have rolled out this policy so far, and it oftentimes happens around elections. And so would it then not be pertinent to say that it is not so much a measure of empowerment but a measure of pacification, and as would it not also act in a manner to stifle sort of the more important, I mean, not necessarily the more important but the more broad ranging issues such as that of actual access as opposed to just a monetary like a feeding of sorts?
It's interesting that you use the word pacification. So, of course, there is the fact that we can look at how cynically political parties are using social welfare for votes. That's right under our noses. But I think what we need to look at beyond that is much more important. The fact is that political parties benefit, they're able to mobilize female voters, but what about the fact that it is tapping into a very real need that women have? So, who are these women? what is their socio-economic context. And I think that is really what I wanted to look at. We there is this term which is very often now bandied about, competitive welfareism. It's a popular strategy, and we're seeing results. And all of those are there, but there are also factors which have led to this moment. And I also think that we're now at 15 and this is only going to spread more. And if that happens, then there's really need for some serious analysis of this.
I mean, that seems entirely fair. But I want to ask you more about when you say who are these women. I want to ask you actually, when you're thinking about it from a policy angle, who benefits most from policies of direct cash transfer, and who is it that it potentially leaves out, or who is it that it benefits more so than others who are more in need of it?
Okay. So I think the one thing to also, and there's, the answer to that is not simple, right?
No.
Because interestingly, and at the time that I was actually looking at the documents of the 15 states and UTs which have actually rolled out this policy, so many of them have very distinct exclusion criteria, right? And that kind of takes us into this argument of, is it a UBI? It's not a UBI. It's very targeted income transfer, although it borrows the idea of UBI. And UBI itself is a very, it's a term which is bandied about in global development. There are many studies that show that it is effective, or even targeted income transfers for that matter. But every state is looking at certain categories of women, leaving out certain categories of women. And even within that, of course, they are all, those who are benefiting are from subsistence level households, low income households. And when we actually look at the amounts that are going, they range from 1,000 rupees to 2,500. Different states have different amounts. It seems very modest. Like, what difference can that make when it comes in every month? But it does make a difference to households which are that precarious. So I
Absolutely.
think the first is to underline that it reaches precarious households.
Hmm. Absolutely. That, I mean, that makes a lot of sense in the long, in the sort of, it's almost like you, instead of doing a targeted transfer which has the possibility of over exclusion, you'd over include, and so then it logically has to follow that people who actually need benefits are actually getting them. But also another intriguing thing that you mentioned was how it's more of competitive or even sort of democratically motivated, a sort of freebie culture, or like there's I mean, that's the critique of it. However, having even sort of ignored that aspect of it, or thinking about it more in terms of, all right, even if this is intended in an ill fashion, it leads to this sort of positive outcome for women. Would you not say that there are other schemes that it might potentially, in the fiscal imagination of how a scheme like this would work, that it would potentially replace, or it would states would be more inclined to do direct cash transfers in this manner, and roll down other schemes that are potentially beneficial because they are targeted and because they only privilege certain kinds of um, access to certain types of people, and so in that sense they're more targeted.
Sure. So, I mean, let's break this down into two questions. The first is the question on democracy, which I think is very relevant. And I mean, one of the ways to think about it, what we see and what it also is, there is no doubt, is a form of, almost a sort of clientelism in politics, right? So what can be called vote buying, that you're bribing the voters. But on the other hand, in this, I also have seen firsthand on the field that sometimes, when and especially women, actually, when they are beneficiaries of welfare, their engagement with politics actually increases, with governance, their interest, their engagement. So last year, I was meeting women voters in Uttar Pradesh just before our general election. And met a lot of women whose household consumption was directly impacted by the fact that there is the food grain scheme, that the sort of 5 kg transfer of free food grain that is there. And while they talked about that, and they talked about, many of them said that, oh, the government is just giving us too much with millets, can you just put this in your piece, that we want wheat. So there was that negotiation, but along with that negotiation on the program itself, there was also negotiation on the fact that these women were just more mobilized because the program was making a difference to their own life and their own sort of, let's say, even domestic sphere. Remember, that means food security, nutrition at household level. And then with that sort of awakening, there was definitely more engagement with civic issues, that, oh my god, sanitation in the village has not been fixed. They were so much more interested in the election and political process. So I feel like there is a flip side to this also, that maybe, and again, this of course should be backed by actual evidence on the ground. So this is me speculating and saying that both of these, as far as the democratic engagement is concerned, both sides exist. As far as the fiscal part of it, and I have to say, first of all, that I did not go into that because I'm not a qualified economist, and my focus was very much social political. But even in that, having spoken with stakeholders, looking at this for a while, I think there are two three things. That one is, of course, that is one big risk, that how will states sustain it. We're seeing, a state like Punjab, where the government announced it just before election, and because their exchequer has, their own bureaucrats and administration have been actually been advising the government that do not roll out this scheme. We simply do not have funds to roll out this scheme. We have a case like Maharashtra, where, of course, the cash transfer scheme was announced with much fanfare before election, got great results. And then, of course, there were all those reports, first about unintended exclusions that happened at one point of time. And the second was that, that they simply had to reduce the budget for the scheme. But I also know that even in a state like Maharashtra, there are attempts to see that how can something like this be implemented with a bit of fiscal prudence. That it is also possible that, one is, yes, that there is a real risk to public finance, that all of the money gets diverted, the finances get diverted to this. But there, in a state budget, so many schemes are allocated and so many budgets are actually just underutilized. And that's especially the case in India with states, that it would just make a lot of sense to actually consolidate those programs. And it is entirely possible to do that. So I know that they are, for example, looking at models where this is sustained, while a lot of life schemes can be rolled out eventually, or just removed from the planning.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, if with enough political and economic imagination, I'm sure there are inroads that we could make into a possibly sustainable model of this. But on the flip side, on the more practical aspect of how these funds actually get used, or who actually gets to tap into them, and even if women are directly transferred these funds, there's several levels of barriers that they would face in using them actually uh, for themselves or for things that matter to them. One such barrier is obviously the fact that women necessarily don't have as much financial autonomy over funds in households. They also might be excluded by the fact that some of this might involve technology that they don't have access to. And on another level, they might not have the financial literacy even if they did have access to these funds. And so, if is there any sort of suggestion that happens on a more top down level of how all of these things can also be accounted for when you're doing direct cash transfers, so as to actually ensure that the intended effect is had?
um So a couple of things. I think, if we first look at the last mile gaps that you brought out, right, which is just access to even banks, which is,
Yeah.
as we know, so much more difficult for women than it is for men. And, for so many reasons, starting with mobility, um, and also confidence, literacy, barriers that they face at home. It's, lack of trust in the banking system higher among women than men. All of those reasons. And I think there, of course, from the top down, from the policy point of view, there is a need to just improve access for it. The banking correspondence scheme, for example, that exists. While it is not difficult, while it is really pretty difficult to build brick and mortars, banks everywhere, but just improving access, and in that, I think the banking correspondence model is is fairly effective. That does not mean that there are no gaps. Like in my own study, I was looking at the case of Karnataka, where this report found that the Griha Lakshmi scheme, there are just so many gaps because of the fact that while the government is making the cash transfers on a monthly basis, the women in the village are not often able to access bank accounts at all. Bank account coverage being as low as it is, which does affect the utilization of resources. The other part that you asked was, do they have financial autonomy? Was it about?
It's more, yes, like you addressed about financial literacy and autonomy. So if you get your hands on the money, and then you might not be able to use it to the best possible effect that it will have for you and your families.
Well, I think that's actually a larger question which is beyond cash transfers, right?
Yeah.
The fact is that, this is negotiated on a daily basis within a family, within a household. And there is just so much evidence that goes to show that, just the very fact that when women do have money in their own bank accounts, but, it has direct impacts on their decision making, on their bargaining power, at least in the domestic sphere. That also includes the cash transfer programs within states. Some of the early studies that are being done in West Bengal, in Karnataka, in Tamil Nadu, in Assam, across these states, that's one of the things that they do bring out, where they've gone, met families, and that the very fact that they feel that their self-respect, self-empowerment does improve within the household, that does not necessarily spill over in the public sphere, but within the domestic sphere there are direct impacts that you see.
Absolutely. I mean, it is to say the least, at least an empirical reason for why all of these schemes might have the desired effect, or an effect positive regardless, for the women that it is targeting. But if I can take you back more towards the discourse part of our conversation around how you mentioned in one of your answers how we need to distinguish this from a UBI, or a universal basic income, and how I mean, apart from the fact that obviously this is only half of the population that is being targeted, how else would you distinguish this from a universal basic income, or sort of a strategy that follows from there? Because once you use terminology such as that, there is a large host of policy angles that come in from a different side, that is not necessarily political, that is not necessarily, it's mostly just about welfare. So, like, how would you distinguish like policy suggestion from a UBI?
So, I mean, I think in India, if we look at the UBI discussion, and of course, the UBI discussion in India is tied very much to the global UBI discussion, and in the development discourse, so much evidence to look at cash transfers for empowerment, all of that. But, and of course, it sort of got revived when the economic survey in 2016-17 talked about it, proposed it, as and did the sort of workings for it, which are now outdated because so much has changed in almost a decade. But kind of laid the groundwork, and then suggested that if India were to look at it, then they should look at half the population, which is the women, because that makes it uh, a lot more feasible. It reduces the fiscal cost of financing a UBI, and of course, also looking at, like, at the backdrop, which was that women face much like higher barriers to economic opportunity, education, skilling, compared to men, and the multiplier effects of investing in women, which then means that you're investing in families, communities, and all of those things. So that was one, and it was left at that. But I mean, it's really important to emphasize here that while states may be inspired by that idea, but it's what they are implementing, and each of them is doing it in very different way from the other. A Goa is doing it differently from an Assam, which is doing it very differently from a Madhya Pradesh. Uh, of course, within the sort of larger framework, which is the same, but there are differences. So that it is targeted income transfers, not to half the population at all, but rather to specific women identified through specific criteria, and income being a very important one. Like most of them will say, okay, the household income should be above 2.5 lakh. And then it varies. When they look at exclusion criteria, Assam might say that we will this that all female beneficiaries over 18 years of age are qualified for it, but West Bengal will actually only have women above 25. Madhya Pradesh is interesting. It says that it will only include women who have either been married or not single women, so they can be divorced or they can be widows. So I mean, and so on and so forth. Tamil Nadu looks at certain land ownership, asset ownership. So between that, it is, I think the sort of wide term that we can all agree with is that these are targeted income transfers, and then every state has its own criteria.
Absolutely. This might be, I mean, to deviate just a little bit from the more theoretical aspect of this, what state would you say is doing the best job at sort of implementing these schemes?
Okay, that's a bit difficult, but I think some states are doing this in ways which are interesting. So, or which are different and which are worth looking at. So I find Assam interesting because they are doing something which is called label cash transfers, and within unconditional cash transfers there is this category, so that the cash transfer remains completely, there is no conditionality to it. Once they identify a group of women, it goes to them. It's a fixed amount every month, but even within that, they have certain ideas on how that cash can be used. A certain amount can go for buying fruits within a household, some amount can go into buying pulses or medicines, and of course it is up to the beneficiary. But there is a behavioral nudge which I think is interesting, just to see that does it make more of a difference, because label cash transfers have been studied globally, and they are found to be effective in sort of making those behavioral changes. Then I think Tamil Nadu actually is another really interesting state. Most of them, of course, talk about women's empowerment, health, nutrition of women, families, children, all of that. What Tamil Nadu does is very directly say that acknowledge the fact that women have women spend a lot of time, especially in India, on unpaid care work, which is higher than any other country in the world. And when they do that, it means that they are excluded from paid work. And this, in a way, is, they say that this income is for that, right? And there will be this again is also an argument where a lot of people say that that does not mean that women should be paid for the fact that they are doing work. But if there, the sort of surveys and studies that have taken place, very initial stages, of course, because all of these programs are what now, a couple of years, it's a little
Mhm.
early to be to know much about what is happening. But all of them say that actually, even in Tamil Nadu, for example, the women are well aware of this messaging, and the fact that yes, they are excluded from paid work, the fact that they can now get a monthly income does empower them, and also compensate for the time that they spend on care work. So yeah, I think different states, some models which are quite interesting.
And would you say that, you've given that your policy is mostly rooted in studies and research that's been done in India, would you say that there's a reference at least to a more global idea, or if there's any specific kind of policy thinking that inspires you on the global level to sort of come to these conclusions, in case somebody wants to sort of trace it back to something?
Yeah, I think it's actually very important to talk about the global context, mostly because this has not happened in India it's happened within the context of this trend really taking root around the world, and especially after COVID-19. So World Bank has done studies that looks at how during COVID-19, when families were faced with a sort of very difficult situations, and the fact that already the world was moving towards digital infrastructure, including in India, governments started programs. So I think that's also when it completely escalated, reached about 186 countries. But if we look at this happening in other countries, I think there are very interesting case studies in Asia, in Latin America, because Latin America has actually been a front runner for cash transfers. They are the ones, especially conditional cash transfers. Brazil, Mexico, they have done some excellent work, which other countries have adapted. Africa has an interesting model, which I think is also worth mentioning, that they, in certain countries, they've tried lump sum transfers instead of monthly transfers. If it's a bigger amount and it comes at one go, there is evidence to show that it leads to more asset creation, which then can actually lead to more financial independence versus monthly transfers of small amounts that come in that actually just are spent on household expenses. And both have their sort of pros and cons. But I think this sort of this argument does not happen in isolation. It's also interesting to see what's happening around the world.
Absolutely. And so to lead you to sort of to lead us to the conclusion of the conversation, I wanted to ask you if there's, I mean, this, let's say there's a, I mean, you're doing policy not in a vacuum, you're doing it in sort of like in several contexts, such, and very specifically for India, across states, there's different context to it. But what is the most ambitious sort of suggestion that you would have, or what is the sort of utopian outcome for cash transfers or for welfare in general that relates to more monetary compensation?
That's an interesting question. I think so. The big question that hangs over this, of course, is the sustainability one, right? Like how do states sustain this? And we, of course, talked about it earlier. But let's say in this scenario that states find ways to keep this going because we see benefits to the lives of people, women especially. The utopian part would really be to see that cash transfers enable women to, beyond just household expenses, for it to actually lead to asset creation, to entrepreneurial activities, to actual financial independence, which is beyond the monthly dependence that is there. So that that there is actually a sort of support that they are able to provide, where women are able to utilize this and sustain.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I mean, it's been fascinating to hear all of the things that you have to account for when you're even sort of trying to make an inroads into policy in this manner. And it's quite inspiring for us to also pick up, some tips on how to, if we're trying to do something along these lines, what we would also have to think about, what kind of questions we would also have to tackle, because these are extremely difficult questions also. And so, but that brings us to the end of the conversation for this podcast, and but it's certainly not the end of the debate for something as
Oh, certainly.
controversial as
Thank you so much, Devika. And I mean, the one thing that I did want to say, which I think it should be front and center of how we look at it, is that this is a very new policy for India as such. It's when we have the long view is when we have a clearer view, which we don't. So what we have is just a couple of years of looking, not enough evidence, and which is why I think it's really good that you've taken an interest in it, and that we just need more arguments, more discussions, and everyone to be talking about this. So thank you for
absolutely.
inviting me.
Thank you so much. Thank you for sparking the conversation and taking it to this like academic spaces and to places where it might actually turn into something that's worth implementing and worth considering. To our listeners, this isn't just about obviously laws or policy or schemes on paper. It's about who holds the pen, who has the power, and who has it in them to deliver on schemes that are actually substantive social welfare and not just bandying about of sort of a propagandas. And so thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us. And so I want to ask our listeners to all stay curious and stay critical, and definitely know that it's not so much that we are restricting the conversation to a theoretical understanding of policy, but hopefully we can extend it to a more practical and a more implementable and a more um, sustainable model. But thank you so much, ma'am, for joining us.
Thank
And
you for your insightful questions.
thank you.